Ethan checked his watch, 11:47 p.m. The metro station was nearly empty, save for a few tired commuters and a homeless man mumbling to himself near a vending machine. Ethan let out a sigh, stepping toward the yellow line as the distant rumble of an approaching train filled the tunnel. He hated late-night rides. Something about the near-silent stations, the flickering lights, and the strange people who only seemed to appear after dark made his skin crawl, but he had no choice. His shift at the hotel ran late, and this was the last train home. The metro screeched to a stop. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, revealing a mostly empty train car. He stepped inside. As soon as the doors shut behind him, an eerie silence settled in. The train lurched forward, and Ethan took a seat near the middle of the car. That's when he noticed something strange. The lights inside the train were dimmer than usual. The air felt colder, and the few other passengers seemed off. A man in a suit sat motionless, with his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists. Across from him, a woman stared at the floor, unblinking, her lips moving, as if whispering to herself. Ethan swallowed hard. Just a normal late-night crowd, right? The metro continued its journey, speeding into the dark tunnels. The windows reflected nothing but blackness. Then, the overhead announcement crackled to life. But it wasn't the usual robotic voice. It was distorted, wrong. Next stop, nowhere. Ethan's stomach twisted. That wasn't right. That wasn't the name of any station. The train didn't slow down. It kept moving, faster and faster, the tunnel outside becoming an endless void. The lights flickered, and when they came back, on half the passengers were gone. Ethan's breath hitched. What the hell just happened? A second ago, there had been at least 10 people in the car. Now, there were only 5. The suited man was still there, frozen in place. The whispering woman, however, was gone. Ethan stood, gripping the metal pole for balance. Did anyone else see that? He asked. No one answered. The remaining passengers sat eerily still, as if they hadn't noticed anything. A teenage boy in a hoodie tapped furiously on his phone, but the screen was black. Ethan stepped closer. Hey, are you okay? The boy didn't react. Ethan waved a hand in front of his face. The boy twitched, his mouth slowly opened, his jaw stretching too wide. A guttural whisper slithered from his throat. You were never supposed to get on. Ethan stumbled back. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. The train jolted violently, and the lights flickered again. More passengers disappeared. Ethan's hands were shaking now. Only 3 people were left. The suited man, a young woman in a red coat, and himself. He turned to the woman. Do you see what's happening? He whispered. She slowly lifted her gaze. Her face was pale, her dark eyes wide with terror. You're seeing it too? She asked. Ethan nodded. Before he could say anything else, the suited man stood up. Ethan barely had time to react before the man turned toward them. He had no face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, pale skin stretched over his skull. The woman let out a choked sob. The faceless man took a step forward. Ethan grabbed the woman's arm. Run! They bolted toward the next car. The doors should have been locked, but they slid open. Ethan and the woman stumbled inside, slamming the doors shut behind them. This car was empty. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. For a brief moment, everything was still. Then, bang! The faceless man slammed against the door. Ethan and the woman flinched, but the man didn't try to open it. Instead, He pressed his smooth, featureless face against the glass. Then he started knocking. Slow, deliberate taps. Knock, knock, knock. The woman whimpered. Ethan took a shaky step back. What the hell is this? The train lurched violently. Then, the door opened. They ran. Through car after car, each one more distorted than the last. One car had bodies hanging from the ceiling. Their eyes were missing, mouths stretched into silent screams. Another was filled with static, hundreds of television screens flickering, showing footage of Ethan and the woman as if they were being watched. Finally, they reached the last car. The woman collapsed onto a seat, sobbing. Ethan turned to the doors at the end of the car, the conductor's cabin. He yanked it open. The cabin was empty. No conductor, no controls, just an old rusted chair and a window looking into pure darkness. The overhead speakers crackled. A voice whispered, "You can't leave." Ethan turned to the woman. She was staring at him, her expression blank. Then, she started to smile. Her mouth stretched too wide. Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. She whispered, "You were never supposed to get on." The train slowed. The doors slid open. Ethan turned, expecting to see a station. But there was nothing. Just an endless black void. A hand grabbed his wrist. He turned and saw himself. A perfect copy of him standing outside the train. The doppelganger smiled. "Your stop." Ethan opened his mouth to scream. The lights flickered. The train pulled into the station. A normal metro station, bright, bustling with people. Ethan blinked, his head pounded. He was sitting in a seat, his hands gripping his knees. Had it been a dream? The intercom chimed. Next stop, Maple Street. The doors opened. Commuters got on. Ethan turned and saw her. The woman in the red coat. She met his gaze, and slowly she smiled. The train doors shut. The first time James saw the man, he thought nothing of it. It was a late Thursday night, the kind where the air smelled like damp pavement and tired city lights. James slumped into his usual seat on the downtown train, the only other passengers scattered in weary silence. He barely noticed the tall figure seated across from him, man dressed in an old gray coat, his face obscured by the angle of his hood. The train jolted forward, lights flickering briefly as it sped into the tunnel. James sighed and pulled out his phone, mindlessly scrolling until the next stop. When he glanced up, the man was still there, unmoving. The doors opened. A few passengers got off. A few more got on. James barely paid attention until 2 stops later, when he switched trains to head toward his apartment. And the man was there again. Same gray coat, the same hood shadowing his face, sitting across from him, perfectly still. A shiver crawled up James's spine. Had the guy followed him? No, impossible. He had switched platforms and taken a different train altogether. There was no way the man could have beaten him here. The train lurched forward again. James kept his head down, trying to ignore the unease gnawing at his gut. But at every stop, every train he transferred to, the man was always there. Never moving, never speaking, just watching. By the time James reached his stop, his nerves were raw. The train doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, but for a moment, he hesitated. His legs felt stiff, his body reluctant to move, as if some unseen force was urging him to stay. Number? He had to get off. Shaking off the eerie feeling, he stepped onto the platform, the air outside heavy with the scent of rain and metal. He pushed through the turnstile, his fingers gripping the cold metal bar a little too tightly. His pulse hadn't slowed, and the feeling of being watched refused to leave him. Something made him glance over his shoulder. The man in the gray coat hadn't moved. He was still there, still seated near the door, but now, with the train preparing to leave, he had turned his head. And he was staring directly at James. Through the smeared, streaked glass, the man's gaze was unnerving, not curious, not annoyed, not even remotely human. It was like looking into something that wasn't supposed to be there, something that had only just remembered how to mimic human expression. The doors slammed shut between them, breaking the moment. The train groaned forward, its wheels screeching against the tracks as it pulled out of the station. But the man, he didn't look away. James stood frozen as the train passed, the windows flashing by in a blur of dim fluorescent light and empty seats. But in each flickering frame, through every shifting pane of glass, the man's face remained visible, locked onto James. Watching, waiting, and then the train was gone. The tunnel swallowed it whole, leaving behind only silence. James exhaled sharply, his breath unsteady. His whole body felt wired, like he had just escaped something he wasn't supposed to escape. He shook his head. Just some guy, coincidence, nothing more. But his legs moved faster than usual as he walked home that night, his keys already in his hand before he even reached the front door. He locked it behind him. And then, just to be sure, he locked it again. James saw him again. He almost didn't board the train. He shouldn't have boarded the train. But he stood there, frozen on the platform, unable to move as his eyes locked onto the familiar gray coat, the hunched shoulders, the hood pulled too far forward. The same man. This time, James wasn't imagining it, because the train hadn't arrived yet. The platform was empty, the rails silent, and the man was already there, sitting in the same seat, inside a train that hadn't even pulled in yet. James blinked. The headlights of the approaching train sliced through the tunnel's darkness, growing brighter, closer. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe, forcing himself to reason. He was tired. He'd had a long day. His mind was playing tricks on him. The train slowed to a stop, doors hissing open. James hesitated. He should go home, take a cab, walk, even anything but this. But the platform was empty behind him, and an unnatural hush had settled over the station. The air felt too thick, too heavy. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a flickering pulse, casting sickly yellow glows onto the tiled floor. He stepped inside. The train was silent. No passengers, no movement. And yet, somehow, he wasn't alone. His eyes were drawn, against his will, to the same spot. The man in the gray coat sat across from him, closer this time. His hood was lower, but something beneath it stirred like shifting shadows, like something alive and restless. James couldn't see a face. Couldn't even see a mouth or a nose, just the vague suggestion of features, obscured by something unnatural. And then the air changed. Thick, wrong. A slow, creeping chill spread through the train car, sinking into James's skin. The overhead lights dimmed, the buzzing growing louder, more erratic. The train wasn't moving, but the world outside the windows was. Shapes flickered past the glass, too fast, too distorted to make sense of. Not buildings, not tunnels, something else. The man in the gray coat twitched. James's breath caught in his throat. His hands gripped the seat beneath him, knuckles white. He didn't dare move. The hooded figure exhaled, and the sound that came from beneath the hood, it wasn't human. A low, rattling hiss, like something breathing through cracked glass. A whispering, rustling noise, like thousands of voices layered on top of each other, overlapping, murmuring in words James couldn't understand. The train jerked forward. James tried to stand, tried to move toward the doors, but his body wouldn't obey. His muscles locked, his breath shallow. The man in the gray coat leaned forward, closer, and James finally saw what was beneath the hood. His scream never left his throat.